It's going to take just a little bit to get yourself settled, but here's what I want. Number one, find a spot to sit. Where you sit should be someplace where you can think and focus while I'm talking, which is not going to be for very long. It's going to be for, like 5 or 10 minutes, but you have to be able to concentrate. And since neither Ms. Fiskin or Mr. Fiskin or Ms. Adams is here today, I'm gonna, so normally we have like sort of 3 people that can kind of help keep you on track, but today we won't be able to. So today, what I'm gonna do is just direct traffic from up here. So if you're not able to focus because of where you're sitting, I'm gonna ask you to move. Don't get upset, it's not personal. Certainly, it's not something where I'm trying to like ruin your fun or spoil your time. But, for example, I know that those of you in the very back 2 rows have a really good spot to hold your phones underneath the table. So if I see you doing this, I'm gonna ask you to move. And if you don't have your phone, I'm still gonna ask you to move. So if you don't want to be asked to move, I want to see your eyeballs, and I want to see like your hands, so that, like that, so that I know that and if I ask you to move, please know, it's not an accusation, go ahead. It's not an accusation, it's not, you're not in trouble, you're not irritated, it's just that from up here, all I can see is what I see from here. So if you want to stay where you are, you gotta help me. Here's some other things. Number one, your Chromebooks should be closed, like closed. I know some of you like to follow along on the notes, but here's the thing. For the most part, it doesn't really help. If you're gonna write stuff down, write stuff down. If you are, because you have an agreement with somebody else here at the school not to write stuff down, it's okay for you to just look up here and listen. Nothing on your screen is gonna help you like stay focused. It's not. So the Chromebooks can be closed. If you're not gonna write something down, that's fine, because you will be able to have access to these notes later. But unless you have an agreement with another staff member in this building that you simply do not need to take notes, I wanna see paper, pencil out. So no electronics, earbuds put away, phones put away, paper, pencil out in front of you so that everybody can write stuff down.
That one.
Where'd you have for lunch today?
I'll tell you after class. Nice try though.
What?
Me and Cody held down the floor.
Okay, if anyone needs paper, there's scratch paper up here. If anyone needs a pencil, there's pencils in the drawer that's just to the right of the doorway. Here's some other things I want you to think about. If the people that you're sitting next to you are going to be an issue because it's going to be distracting for you, then you can move now. And I am not going to look at you and move you because of who you're sitting next to. I absolutely will not do that. But if I don't get the impression that you're really focused, paying attention, thinking about what I'm presenting to you, then I'm going to either move you or somebody else near you, because that's the only other thing. Yo.
Can I get water really quick?
Yes. So here's a couple things to think about. Number one, Mr. Fiskin has talked about something called an adaptation. So here, you close it, yeah, thanks. And make sure you got something to write on, and I'm gonna have you write some stuff down in just a minute. But before we do that, I want you to think about something. Mr. Fiskin has talked about this idea of something called an adaptation. What is an adaptation? Does anybody know what an adaptation is? Melanie, what do you think?
Adaptation, it had a copy, but then you make another copy and you kind of slightly alter it a little
That's an interesting way of thinking about it. An adaptation is sort of a change. So outside of biology, that certainly is how we use it, right? Like if I had an umbrella out in my yard and it kept blowing over, then I might like create an adaptation by like tying it to a tree or something like that. In biology, it's something a little bit different. Yuri, what do you think?
Is it a stage that helps the species survive?
Yeah, so this is what's really cool about an adaptation. It is something that we can easily identify about an organism that helps it either survive or reproduce. So virtually everything that we see in living things, whether it's a plant or bacteria or a fungus or whatever, virtually everything that we see got there because of evolution. But there's lots of different reasons that things can evolve. One way that things can evolve is completely by random chance. And another way that things can evolve is through this thing that Mr. Fiskin talked about called natural selection. When something evolves because of natural selection, there may not necessarily be things that we really notice. There's genetic changes that occur, but we might not really notice it. When we talk about an adaptation, we're talking about something that evolved through natural selection that serves a really clear purpose. So, for example, I do not have a dimple in my chin, and some of you do, right? The legendary butt chin. Is that an adaptation? I mean, I don't think that we can really say like that people with a butt chin are more likely or less likely to survive. It's just not like it. How did it get there? Well, it was evolution, like played a role in that. But it's not really likely that that is something that came about that has changed materially our survival as individuals or as a species. Well, let's look at some other things, like thumbs. We talk about thumbs a lot in biology, and the reason is because thumbs are an incredible adaptation. If you've ever injured your thumb in any way, and I've broken my thumb. I broke my thumb once a long time ago, but mostly what happens is sometimes in the winter, my fingers get so dry that they crack, and when they crack, then they hurt really bad. And sometimes my thumb will hurt so bad that I basically can't use it. And you know what? I notice it. Has anybody here ever broken a thumb or injured their thumb? You notice it, don't you? Like, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for school, it's a big deal for sports, it's a big deal for just like, I don't know, like brushing your hair, putting on makeup, or tying your shoes, like we notice it. Yeah. And the reason is because thumbs are an amazing adaptation. The way that they're designed, they're called opposable because they move one direction, the rest of your fingers move in a different direction. That means we can grab things. We can grab things between our finger and our thumbs, and it's astounding, the versatility that that gave us. That is tied directly to our ability to use and exploit tools. That is tied directly to the evolution of our intelligence, which means we're smart because of our thumbs. And that's kind of a crazy thing to think about, but when we talk about adaptations, that's really what we're looking at. So today, what we're going to look at is something that is related to adaptations. It's something called adaptive radiation. And adaptive radiation basically happens when you have a new environment or some sort of change that allows for rapid evolution of a bunch of different species, all of which are very clearly related to a common ancestor, but they all have really different visible adaptations. They look different, they act different, and it's really obvious what those differences are for. And we see that a lot. We see that a lot in species that we that are still around, and we see it a lot in the fossil record. So that's going to be what we look at today. Today, much of the work that you're going to be doing is going to be on these big whiteboards. And so at the end of the class, I'm going to have you turn in a picture. And if you are working with a group, which you will be, I'm gonna ask you to work in pairs, maybe groups of 3 in some cases. I want all of you to get a picture and get it turned in, because otherwise I may not know that you did it. So I want a picture turned in. Ideally, it'll have your name on it, and if there was somebody else that worked with you, their name will be on it as well. Okay, so what I'm gonna start with here is some basic information about adaptive radiation. And as always, the way that notes work in this class is if I write it or draw it, you write it or draw it, and if I underline it, you write it. And again, unless you have spoken with somebody else in this building and you have some sort of written thing that says you don't have to take notes, I want to see paper and pencil out, and I want to see you writing. And if I'm looking at you, it means that I want to see paper and pencil out. I want to see you be writing. So, let's do this. This is part of being a student, and it's interestingly, many of you might discover, if you don't already know this, that it is kind of fun sometimes. I'm not going to say that it's fun for everybody, but some of you probably like taking notes. It's kind of fun. It's fun, isn't it?
No, you don't.
You make it. You can, like for me, it's this. It's an exercise. It's like a little bit of an artistic endeavor. How can I do this in a way that looks good and feels organized and is legible? And yeah, I don't know. So that's it. It's its own little challenge. So today we're going to review a couple of things. One is we're going to talk about what a species is and what speciation is. And then we're going to tie in this idea of adaptive radiation to species and speciation and adaptations. We're going to tie all those things together. And so Mr. Fisk can talk about this with you, but just to review, when we think about a species, what we're thinking about is a group of organisms that can and do reproduce. And I will have to tell you that the truth is, this is not really a great definition of species for all organisms. It works really well for animals. It works really well for most plants. It does not work well for a bunch of other organisms, though. Bacteria, for example, and archaea, those reproduce by just splitting apart. You don't need 2 of them. So to determine whether one bacterial cell is a different species than another bacterial cell, you can't just look and wait and see if they're gonna mate, because they won't. So, but this is a great definition for most animals. And what this allows us to do is really clearly differentiate, on an obvious level, right? Like if you show me a black bear in the Willamette National Forest, and you show me a black bear in the Coast Range, and they may look a little bit different. They have different habitats. They will eat different things because of the availability. But if we were to move those 2 bears together, if one was male and one was female, they could and probably would mate and reproduce. The offspring would be another black bear, and that is so we say they're the same species. They don't live in the same spot, but we'd say they're the same species. So, but if we were to take a black bear from the Willamette National Forest and then a zebra from the savannah in Africa, you bring those 2 organisms together, and you might fighting or predation, but you're not going to get reproduction. And so this ends up being for broadly different things, this works really well as a definition of species. Where we do see some ambiguity is where we have things that are called subspecies, so 2 organisms that kind of look different and behave differently, but they actually can reproduce, and they may live in a different spot, but if you bring them together, they could, and then you get these weird gray areas. This right here is a picture I took of an owl in a tree that was at my house about 10 years ago. And so I wanted to know what kind of an owl it was, so I looked it up. And some of the characteristics matched what we call a barred owl, and some of the characteristics match the northern spotted owl. Thank you. And I didn't know which one it was. So I took this picture and I sent it off to OSU. I just looked up some people at OSU who know birds. And I was like, what did I find here? And it was so cool because not only did they come right back and say, oh, that's a barred owl, spotted owl hybrid. They actually knew which owl it was. You can't see it in this picture, but in some of the other pictures I took, you can see it's got a little metal band around its one of its feet. I didn't notice it when I sent it, but after they said, oh yeah, we know that guy. They knew it was a male, they knew it was a hybrid, and they kind of knew what its territory was because they've been tracking it over the years. So we're gonna ignore that. We're not gonna play around with hybrids and subspecies, and sometimes taxonomists, biologists will argue about things. Like one person will say these are two different species and another person will say no, they're not. We're not gonna get into any of that, but it's just kind of fun to think about. So we're just gonna be looking in this class at things that are really vastly different. So this is gonna be our functional definition of a species. Our day-to-day definition is gonna be, we know it when we see it, right? If you see two things and you think those have gotta be two different species, you're probably right. And that's gonna be how we kind of operate. When we talk about what we know about different species, a big chunk of it comes from organisms that aren't around anymore. And we figured this out a long time ago. There was a period of time where we didn't quite know what we were looking at, but pretty quickly we realized that in rocks, we can see evidence of things that clearly must have been living organisms. And rocks that either are living organisms or contain living organisms are referred to as fossils. So if you look at a rock on the Oregon coast, there's a reasonable chance that you'll find evidence of fossilized or fossilizing organisms. It's not uncommon to find rocks that have what look like stone seashells embedded in them. And those are probably millions of years old. And they were the shells of living organisms that died, and then their shells were mineralized. And that happens with things like bone and shells and like nails, the stuff that makes nails. So like insects have their external covering is made of something really similar to what our fingernails are made of. Those things get preserved. Other things don't. We don't have fossil records of like a lot of bacterial species or mushrooms and stuff like that because those soft parts get lost. When we look at these fossil organisms, sometimes we can't tell if they can and would have reproduced, even if they were in the same place at the same time. It's not as easy as it is now, because now we can just like try it and see. If we have two fish, we want to know if they're the same species, put them in a tank together. If they reproduce, they're the same species. If they don't, they're not. But we can't do that with fossil remains. So we have to kind of, again, use our judgment. So horses are a really great example of fossil evidence because we have a bunch of it. And what we know is that there have been really dramatic changes in the way that horses have looked over millions and millions of years of evolution. And so so we just make the assumption that Mesohippus and Equus, the modern horse, wouldn't have been able to reproduce. Are we sure about that? No, we don't know. But we see enough evidence of differences that we're assuming that they would not be reproductively compatible. So what we do with the fossil record is we kind of have these, like, again, these sort of blurry lines where we're like, we're not exactly sure, but at some point, what was this species became this species. This and this are clearly not the same. This existed at some point in the past. This existed later on. So we're going to call them two different species. And this speciation generally happens because of natural selection. Natural selection, as Mr. Fiskin explained, has to do with the environment. So often we can kind of like tie together the things that we're seeing, both in the fossil record and in living organisms, with things that we see in the environment. And that's where the adaptive radiation thing comes in, because the adaptive radiation is all about how well an organism fits with its environment. And we tend to see adaptive radiation happen when there is a big change in an existing environment, or when a certain organism migrates to a new environment. So what we see is that there's some original organism, like a bird, one species of bird, but if it makes it to a new spot, then over a relatively short period of time, still hundreds of thousands to millions of years, but over a relatively short period of time, we see a whole bunch of new species emerge. So this adaptive radiation happens when you start with a common ancestor and you end up with a bunch of really different species in a short amount of time. It's called radiation because when we draw it, it often kind of looks like this. We'll start with the ancestral species, and then we'll kind of show all the species that evolved from it in sort of a fan out around from that ancestral species. So you can kind of imagine it radiating outward. And we call it adaptive because we can see adaptations in the organisms that have evolved. We can see them. Sometimes, if it's living, we can see exactly what those adaptations are about, and other times we can't. We can see this both in the fossil record and in existing species. So we see evidence of adaptive radiation, for example, in like one of the earliest incidents of adaptive radiation that we saw, called the Cambrian explosion. There was this massive radiation of different kinds of species. We went from, not much variation and diversity in living organisms to a huge variety of animals. And that was called the Cambrian explosion. And we've seen it over and over in the fossil record. It's more definitive when we look at existing species. When we see organisms like these birds that are clearly different, but all also clearly related to some common ancestor, we can be pretty sure that adaptive radiation has occurred. And so I mentioned there's two parts to this, right? The radiation is that you get many species quickly from one ancestor. The other piece is that they have unique adaptations. So remember, an adaptation is something like we can see it, like we can identify it. If you look at these organisms here, just these pictures, what's the first difference that jumps out? The beaks. The adaptations here, there's more than just beaks, but the visible, obvious adaptations here have to do with the beaks. This is Darwin's finches, and I think Mr. Fiskin brought that up, right? He mentioned that, Darwin's finches. So this is like, they're not Darwin's, it's just that he kind of saw them and used this as an example. Here's what he realized. He realized that off the coast of South America, there were all these birds that on the Galapagos Islands that were a type of finch, but they weren't the same. On the mainland, there was another type of finch. There was just one. I mean, there's maybe more than one, but there was one that seemed to clearly be similar to these, but that wasn't on the Galapagos Islands. And so what Darwin thought is, okay, wait a second, what if a couple of these finches, like, they're flying around in South America, and then there's this huge storm, they get blown over to the Galapagos Islands. Miraculously, they survive, and they're the only finches there. What happens next? And what happens next, we surmise, is that original ancestral population of finches that looked like the ones that lived on the coast in South America had all sorts of different foods available to them. So they may have found that there were big seeds that were kind of hard to get into. And so the birds that had sort of shorter, thicker, stronger beaks were able to get into those seeds. There were also tons of insects that might have been in like pieces like decaying wood. And so the birds that had longer, thinner, curved beaks had a better chance of getting those insects. And then there was all sorts of flowers that didn't exist on the mainland. And birds that had beaks that were adapted to getting into flowers and drinking nectar, which is basically like sugar water, they were able to survive and reproduce. So these organisms evolved to fit their food source, and it happened really quickly. And what we ended up with is, I can't remember how many, there's like 12 or 18 finches there that don't exist on the mainland. They all seem to be clearly related to this ancestral finch. And so this was an example of adaptive radiation. In this case, it happened because it was a new environment. So the species colonized a new habitat. But we also see adaptive radiation if there's a change. No, it's not you. It wasn't me either, it's this stupid thing. So a change in environment can do the same thing. Change environment or a colonization of new habitat. Either way, we can get this adaptive radiation. So what I'm gonna ask you to do today, this is posted to Canvas, and I'll show you a couple of things here that I think would be helpful. The first thing is there's an actual assignment associated with this that has some instructions. And for those of you that really benefit from having kind of a step-by-step list of instructions, things kind of broken down for you, this is there, and I'll show it to you momentarily. But sometimes it's easier to just think about what are you gonna do? And so here's what you're gonna do. You have these ridiculous little cartoon cutouts. And the story, you don't need to know, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. Behind these ridiculous little cartoon cutouts is that when I was a student teacher in Washington in the spring of 1998, which is a long, long time ago, my cooperating teacher had these. I don't know where she got them from. And I thought, that's neat. And I took some copies. I mean, she gave them to me, right? I didn't steal them. She let me have some. And I've been using them ever since. And over the years, as the power of the internet has grown, I've tried to track these down. I don't know where they came from. I don't know who drew them. I don't know where the assignment came from. And mostly, what I want is they're just cute. And so mostly what I want is more drawings like this, because I think they're really, really cute. The work we're gonna do today, despite the fact that these are cute little drawings, is actually serious. So what I'm gonna ask you to do is try to figure out how these organisms are related to each other and to a single common ancestor. We're gonna pretend that there was adaptive radiation. I don't know what these things are. They're just creatures. What I want you to imagine is that at one point there were some of these creatures, and there weren't very many different types. It was just sort of a basic creature. And that creature discovered a new habitat. A small population, those little creatures, found this new habitat. And the new habitat was really diverse. And so there was a lot of evolution that happened, a lot of adaptations that were developed in a really short amount of time. And some of the adaptations are visible. Things like scales, which are useful in dry areas, or feathers, which are useful structures for organisms that fly, or hair or fur that can help keep things warm, that are good for insulation. There's also other things that you might see, you might notice sort of external coloration. And external coloration can be a big deal. The difference in color between two different kinds of organisms can be an indication that those are two different species, but more often that's not true. If you see two species of bird that look really similar, the only difference is one of them is a little bit different colored, they're more likely to be really closely related. In fact, in birds, sometimes there's more difference between males and females of the same species than there are between any two birds of a different species. Yeah?
Well, the reason behind that is because the female birds are meant to like stay in the nest, so their colors more even, I guess.
Yeah.
Trees, and the males are trying to attract the females, so they have to be very excessive.
Bingo, yes, and there's a name for that. Actually, it's a type of evolution called sexual selection. And yeah, so basically what it has to do with is advertising your awesomeness. And so there's going to be other things that you see, like you may notice organisms that look like they could swim, or organisms that have 4 legs. And those organisms are more likely to be related to each other, but not necessarily, because sometimes we're going to see 2 critters that look sort of similar, but they're actually kind of distantly related because of something called convergent evolution. And you've probably heard of that. We're not going to talk about it right now. We might talk about it later, but it's interesting to think about. So there's 2 stages to this. Stage 1 is that you're going to take your critters, and there's 32 of them. So you're going to actually cut them out. You're going to have you and a partner working together with 32 of these species. And then there is this template. And the template is small. And I don't want you to write on it. What I want you to do with the template is take it and very quickly put it onto one of these big whiteboards. So, and it doesn't need to be, it shouldn't take you more than about 5 minutes to transfer this template onto this whiteboard. And once you've got those templates transferred, then you're going to take your cutout critters and you're going to start grouping them together. And you're going to, there's a lot of guesswork here. You're going to group them together by what they look like. So let me show you what that's going to look like. These are the critters, all right? And so you might find that like, oh, well, there's these ones that kind of look like turtles. Let's put those together. And then there's these ones that have like fur, and we can put those together. And then there's these ones that look like they have wings, and this one looks like it's got wings. And you can put all these together visually, just like lump them together. And I couldn't fit them all on one sheet, so I have them like on 2 sheets, but you'll be able to just move them around. So these 2 kind of look like swimmers. This one looks like a swimmer too. So you kind of group everything together based on like your gut instinct. And then you're going to use clues on the template to try to figure out where they go. So for example, this one, so there's a starter. This one has a number 4 on it, and the template has a number 4 on it. So you can put that cutout right where it belongs on your big whiteboard. And then we have these 2, and these 2 both fly. And if you look at the pieces, they'll say whether they're extinct or not. So there's some clues, like this one is extinct, and this one is extinct, but this one isn't. And then on the diagram, it tells you which ones are extinct, and it gives you other clues like hops and crawls and flies. And so, so when I look at this, I see these 2 that fly. They've got wings and feathers and stuff, and so I don't know for sure, but it is a reasonable conjecture that they go here. These 2 fly, they're not extinct. You might find, as you're working, that some of them don't play out right. You may put something somewhere and then you have to kind of back out and start over again. And once you get all your organisms sorted out and on the chart, let me know and I'll come around and take a look at it. And you might be close, you might have it perfect, there might be some things that you need to change. But after you've got your diagram, if there's time, and there may not be time, I want you to think about these questions. And it says on the back of your diagram, but you can actually just write it right on the whiteboard. Because instead of printing these out on big pieces of paper, we're writing it on the whiteboard. So just write your answers on the whiteboard. And then when I tell you at the end of class, you're going to take a picture of what you've got with your name on it, and you'll turn that picture into Canvas. All right. Everybody Ready to rock and roll with our little creatures? Okay, let's make it happen. Let me know if you have questions.